They stopped shooting. They laid their weapons on the ground. Some of them raised their hands slowly, afraid that even a sudden movement might get them killed. These Canadian soldiers believed that surrender still meant something. They believed that the rules of war still existed. They believed that once the fighting stopped, mercy would begin. What happened next proved how wrong they were. August 19, 1942, began like so many military operations in World War II. Before sunrise, under tension, with young men packed tightly together, gripping rifles and thoughts of home. The destination was Dieppe, a coastal town in Nazi-occupied France. This operation was never meant to become legendary. It was supposed to be quick, controlled, and instructional. A raid, a test. Something Canada could learn from and walk away from. Instead, Dieppe became one of the bloodiest days in Canadian military history, and one of the darkest chapters that many preferred not to speak about. Canada was still proving itself on the world stage. Thousands of young Canadians had volunteered, convinced they were defending freedom, fighting tyranny, and protecting the people they loved back home. Farmers, factory workers, students, sons and brothers, most of them had never seen real combat before. They trusted their commanders, they trusted the plan. And above all, they trusted that even in war, certain lines would not be crossed. As the landing crafts approached the French coast in the early morning darkness, that trust began to crack. German defenses were not surprised. They were ready. The moment the ramps dropped, machine gun fire ripped across the beach. Men fell before they could even step onto the sand. Tanks became useless, trapped or destroyed almost instantly. Communication lines broke down, orders were lost, and confusion spread faster than fear. Within minutes, it was obvious that this mission was failing. Still, many Canadian soldiers fought on. They crawled forward under fire. They dragged wounded friends to cover that barely existed. They fired until their rifles clicked empty. Some fought until they were wounded, others until they were surrounded. And eventually, for many, there was nothing left to do but surrender. It was not cowardice, it was survival. They believed that laying down their weapons was the last rational choice left. White cloths were waved, rifles were dropped, hands went up. According to the laws of war, surrender was supposed to mean protection. Prisoners of war were not to be harmed. That was the promise written into every convention, every agreement, every so-called rule that separated soldiers from murderers. The Canadian soldiers at Dieppe believed in those rules. That belief would cost many of them their lives. German troops approached the surrendered Canadians. Some prisoners were ordered to stand in lines, others forced to kneel. Wounded men struggled to remain upright, terrified that collapsing would be seen as resistance. Survivors later described the confusion, shouting in German, gestures they did not understand, moments where it seemed things might calm down. And then, without warning, shots were fired. Not chaotic battlefield fire, but deliberate close-range killing. Unarmed Canadian soldiers were beaten. Some were shot where they stood. Others were executed after surrendering, their weapons already on the ground. These were men who had survived the worst of the beach assault, only to be killed after the fighting had stopped. This was no longer combat, it was slaughter. Imagine experiencing this from the ground. You are barely 21 years old. Your leg is bleeding, your ears are ringing, and your heart is pounding so loudly you can barely think. You believe the worst is over because you are alive. Then you see the man next to you, your friend, someone you trained with, someone who joked with you days earlier, fall to the ground after an execution shot. In that moment, you realize surrender has not saved you. It has only changed how you might die. For those who were not killed immediately, the nightmare continued. Prisoners were marched inland under armed guard. Wounded men were struck for being too slow. Some were kicked, others punched, stripped of dignity and hope at the same time. Survivors later said that the physical pain was terrible, but the psychological terror was worse. There were no explosions anymore, no chaos of battle. Only silence, broken by boots on gravel and the sound of someone collapsing behind you, never knowing if you would be next. What makes this story even more disturbing is that it was not an isolated misunderstanding. Multiple survivor accounts described deliberate brutality after surrender. Yet for years, these stories were softened, ignored, or buried beneath larger strategic discussions. Dieppe was labeled a necessary lesson, a failure that taught the Allies how not to conduct future landings. From a military perspective, it became a stepping stone to later successes like D-Day. But from a human perspective, it was something far uglier. Out of nearly 5,000 Canadians who took part in the Dieppe raid, more than 900 were killed. Nearly 2,000 were captured. For Canada, it was the deadliest single day of the entire war. These numbers are often mentioned quickly, almost clinically, but numbers do not scream, bled, or beg for mercy. People do. And many of those people never made it home, not because they kept fighting, but because they stopped. The survivors who returned years later carried scars that could not be seen. Many refused to talk about Dieppe at all. Not to their families, not to their children. How do you explain surviving a battlefield only to witness surrender turn into execution? How do you describe the guilt of living when others were killed after trusting the same rules you did? For some, silence was the only way to survive peace. Families back in Canada waited. Mothers waited for letters that never came. Wives waited at train stations that stayed empty. Children grew up without fathers, often without even knowing exactly how or where they died. The official explanations were vague. The truth was uncomfortable, and uncomfortable truths are the easiest to hide. History often remembers wars through victories, strategies, and heroes. Dieppe does not fit neatly into that narrative. There was no triumphant ending, no clear success to celebrate. Just loss, confusion, and a question that still lingers. What happens when the rules stop protecting those who believe in them? The Canadian soldiers at Dieppe did not fail because they were weak or unprepared. Many fought with extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. They failed because war does not always honor its own laws. They believed that surrender still meant humanity, and for that belief many paid with their lives. This is why the story matters. Not because it changes the outcome of World War II, but because it forces us to confront a darker truth about conflict. When fear, hatred, and dehumanization take over, even the most basic promises collapse. White flags become meaningless. Mercy disappears. This is not just a story about World War II. It is a warning carried through history. A reminder that bravery does not always protect you, and that sometimes the most dangerous moment of all is when you believe the worst is over. Because once humanity is gone, no rule, no agreement, and no surrender can bring it back.